Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us. This is Lauren Novadelli, Hispanic Public Information Officer. And once again, thanks for joining us in this weekly media briefing and public health update with Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich. Joining us today is Dr. James Bridgers, Director of the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as Dr. Nina Ashford, Chief of Public Health Services. Assistant Chief Administrative Officer Dr. Earl Stoddard is also here. And our special guests today are Ganesh Sitaraman, Founding Director, Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator, as well as Professor Christopher Serkin, Vanderbilt University Law School. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Mr. County Executive, good afternoon. And you do have a 1:20 hard stop today.
I'm going to do my best to get there. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining us today. And I want to thank my guests in advance. We've had many conversations about housing affordability in our region. And of course, most recently, the council passed the More Housing Now package, which will allow the development of duplexes and triplexes and apartments along corridors throughout the county with no actual requirements for affordable housing built in. And no concern that almost half the residents that could be displaced in this are actually renters, largely minority, who will lose their homes through this process. It's kind of amazing that we still have to talk about that, but we still do have to talk about that. Our goal as a government and a community should be to ensure that our planning meets our needs and increases our housing supply directly and efficiently. Changing our community through zoning text amendments is not the way to do this. This county has been planned for future growth. The idea that this bill is necessary to accommodate the future is absolutely untrue. With the existing county master plans already in place, there is capacity for more than 85,000 units to be built within those master plans. And there are over 30,000 units in addition that have already been approved and only require a developer to go forward by pulling their building permit. No further approvals are needed. We don't lack for zoning to address growth, and we don't lack for land to address growth. What we lack is, frankly, we have not had the demand to drive the development or the build out of some of these master plans yet. We've not had the land. We don't have the jobs, actually. Our problem has been a sluggish growth in jobs, which has temped down some of the demand for housing that we would have otherwise seen. The master plans that we have grew out of efforts to support smart growth. So if you were to open up our master plans and look at what we've done over the 12 years I was on the council and most of the time that this council's been there, they've opened up areas to additional growth that were largely underdeveloped and had opportunities for better use of the commercial and underdeveloped land that was around these areas. This is where development should go and where it's zoned to go. And abandoning that and trying to force growth into existing neighborhoods actually undermines the planned growth of these communities. And, a simple example would be, Wheaton, which was zoned for high rises, still has not been built out. There's one high rise development that's in the process of going forward. Most of the rest of the land isn't being developed. Had that not been zoned for high rises, for which there is a very limited market with very limited incomes who qualify to live there, had it been zoned more reasonably, those projects probably would have been done, or more of them would have been built, because they could have built a wider range of housing, address a wider range of affordability. And that's not something you can do when you zone a downtown for high rises. I've talked with people who've done this type of rezoning. Arlington comes to mind. And one of the recurring themes, and it's true here, it's true in Minneapolis, it's true in Portland, true in San Francisco, is this drive to rezone single-family neighborhoods largely comes in urban areas. They come in urban areas that have been long-term redeveloped. I mean, think about New York City, which is doing some of this. Minneapolis, goes back over 100 years of history, is largely built out. Arlington, just across the river, largely built out, no place for additional housing, no place for substantial amounts of additional housing where they could house the future population. Our situation is different, with the ability to develop 85,000 new housing units in the master plans. We have already provided for the ability to accommodate future growth here. We actually, according to COG, have more housing units than we need by 2050. That's how much we've zoned for in this county. We're not even done zoning yet. So we don't lack the ability to accommodate people. What we lack is enough demand for the housing units to be built. And to have this conflated and have this ZTA, which basically focuses on densifying existing areas, kind of, and treating as if this is some kind of emergency we must do to address the housing needs, is really a distortion of the situation we're in. We'd do a lot better if we had an honest discussion about what we've zoned for, and is there not enough affordability in what we've zoned for? Is that's one of the things that holding back population growth in this county, the lack of affordable housing. But the CTA didn't actually have required affordable housing units. You could do duplexes instead of triplexes and do everything at market. And you could build small apartment buildings and avoid MPDUs. So I don't see this as the path to the future. And, the more I talk to people around the country about what they've done, we don't match the pattern for people who've had to take these steps. So I've invited on a couple of professors from Vanderbilt to discuss the affordable housing situation. Their work through Vanderbilt Law School analyzes zoning policies that purport to address the housing crisis. So I'd like to welcome Ganesh and Sitaraman and Christopher Serkin to this media briefing. And let's start by talking about why focusing exclusively on zoning is misguided.
Terrific. Thank you so much for inviting us here today. It's a real pleasure having this chance to talk to you all about a topic that we've been thinking a lot about. Ganesh and I have divided up our responsibilities here today. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, sort of framing our contribution a little more broadly, and then Ganesh will jump in talking about some of the specific proposals that we want to make sure people are thinking about and talking about. So there's no real question that there's a housing crisis in this country. The affordability problem is pervasive in many, many parts of the country. Something like 30% of all Americans are now housing cost burdened by HUD definitions. And addressing affordability and housing costs has become a central policy issue across the country. And if you're following national debates about this, just as the county executive said, what you are going to hear is zoning, zoning, zoning. That is, zoning reform is the key to solving the affordability problem in the national discourse. This is what you hear. And if you look at the diagnosis in the sort of national discussions around this issue, what you will hear is that zoning restrictions fundamentally are limiting the supply of new housing across the country, that developers want to build, that home buyers and renters want places to live, and that it's restrictive local zoning and land use regulations that get in the way. In other words, if not for zoning, says this critique, we would have plenty of housing, and not just housing, we would have dense housing in the urban core, we wouldn't have sprawl, we'd create residential mobility, and we would unlock all of the promise that's locked up today. And in this account then, the problem of housing affordability is the problem of NIMBY neighbors using zoning as a form of opportunity hoarding to keep newcomers from moving into their neighborhoods. We're going to take issue with this account, let me just be clear, but if you follow this view, this diagnosis of the problem, it comes with a very straightforward set of prescriptions. Get rid of zoning, or at least loosen it dramatically. That is, eliminate density restrictions, allow multifamily housing everywhere, eliminate single-family zoning, defang environmental regulations and historic preservation, and at the extreme, actually eliminate local land use regulations entirely in order to unlock the market and unlock the ability to produce as much housing as we need. Now, that really is the landscape of the current national discourse around zoning. And the real question that people seem to be wrestling with at the national level is simply how to loosen zoning and how quickly, and how can we accomplish this as fast as possible. Okay. Fundamentally, our intervention is to argue that this focus on zoning is myopic. It's just too narrow. We need to look at a broader set of problems that are producing our affordability crisis and a broader set of solutions. In other words, I think our argument is act like this is an actual crisis and do more than just deregulate land use regulation. So we think it's not correct to have a single national discourse about this with a single set of prescriptions, because in fact, local conditions are very different in different places, and the dynamics around the housing market are very different in different places. And we also think that focusing so much on zoning distracts from other sets of really important and in many places more meaningful policy interventions that should be possible. And if you think about it, if your focus in housing policy is really only on zoning reform and loosening zoning restrictions, you are putting a lot of faith in housing markets, right? The idea of the zoning reform movement at its core is that a deregulated or less regulated housing market is going to produce better outcomes. And I think Ganesh and I are both skeptical that housing markets work well enough that we should take such a passive approach to simply allowing housing markets to work their magic, that we can just deregulate and hope that developers and financiers will solve all our housing problems by building more. It's important up front to be clear what we are and aren't arguing, though. We do think zoning is sometimes a problem. I just want to be very explicit about that. We are not here to defend zoning in its current form in lots of parts of the country. Sometimes zoning is a really big and important problem in New York City, in Boston, in lots of parts of California. There's no real question that zoning regulations, land use regulations, are a significant impediment to producing the new housing that we need. And in those places, rezoning is likely to produce better housing outcomes. But we just don't think that this is true everywhere. In a lot of the Sun Belt, like in Nashville, Tennessee, where Ganesh and I both live and work, I will tell you that zoning is not the main impediment or limitation on growth. In fact, if you look at Nashville or Houston or Phoenix, these are places that actually demonstrate what happens when you adopt a very light zoning approach and unlock housing markets. And what you get is not affordable, dense, new urbanist design, right? What you get is expensive, land-consuming suburban sprawl that actually imposes lots of other kinds of costs and doesn't solve our housing problem. So at the highest level of generality then, we want to point out that the regulatory reforms that make sense in California may not be the same ones that are necessary everywhere, in Nashville, in Maryland. What we need is to be more careful in our diagnoses of local housing dynamics and the limitations or problems on growth in those places. And zoning is a piece of the puzzle, often, but it's only one piece. And in policy circles today, you would think that zoning reform is the only answer to this problem, and we are looking to expand that regulatory toolkit. And Ganesh is going to talk about specifically the ways that we propose doing that.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks to the executive and thanks to everyone for being here. We're grateful for the chance to be able to talk with you about some of the work we've been doing. And, you know, as Chris said, our main goal is to try to expand the conversation from one that is narrowly focused only on zoning to the wide range of other problems and, perhaps more importantly, other solutions that we might be thinking about and could adopt to take a more active role to try to address the problems of housing affordability. And I think that's a key part of it, taking an active role as opposed to a passive one. As Chris said, you know, the idea that you can just loosen zoning and have a functioning housing market that will provide all the affordable housing that we need is really a sit back and wait approach. It is one that says, let's just let actors in the market do whatever they're going to do, and let's hope it works out for us. A more active approach would require people in government to start thinking about how we can build the kind of housing market we want in our communities. And that's going to be different in different communities, as Chris said, because they have different kinds of needs, different conditions, different geographies, and topographies as well. So in the paper, what we do is we outline really 4 categories that we think are additional areas where one could take a more active approach to thinking about shaping housing markets in a way that would expand housing supply and affordability. Within each of these 4 areas, we offer a wide variety of policy solutions, some of which are at the federal level, some of which are at the state or local level. And the idea of them is not to say that all of these are necessary, or even that any one of them is necessary, but really to provide a set of options, a kind of menu of ideas to expand the conversation from this very narrow one that we're having at the national level into one that has a lot more texture to it. So the 4 categories that we talk about first is an industrial policy for housing. And you may have heard the term industrial policy used in the national conversation around things like supply chains or semiconductors. But the basic idea of industrial policy is that the government has, at any level, state, federal, or local, decides to take an interest in a specific sector because it wants to invest more in that sector. And the housing sector is a sector of our economy, and governments could take more of an active approach to thinking about what policies in that sector could help build it up. And so we identify a number of different areas within this that could be of interest to communities interested in housing. Thinking about modular construction, for example, as a way to reduce the cost of construction. Modular construction is a way that is, you could think of it as sort of more like industrial production, where you're building multiple different houses, but through a kind of standardized process, rather than building every house on its own on the geography in which the house will be built, a kind of bespoke one-by-one kind of approach. A similar idea that some jurisdictions have picked up on is not construction at the modular or manufactured level, but is pre-approving building patterns and designs so that you don't have to get every possible building approved individually, but there's a kind of default template. Here's one approval. It's always approved as long as you follow this architectural pattern. And that would then allow developers to say, hey, as long as we build on this pattern or set of 5 or 6, we don't have to go through additional approvals. Industrial policy also often includes the other inputs that are necessary to making a sector work well. And here, I think there are some important questions that communities really need to address. When you look at some communities that have challenges with home building, it's not actually about zoning or about even construction per se. It's about workforce. Are there enough people who can actually do the building? Or it's about infrastructure. Do you have the roads? Do you have the water resources? Do you have the utility resources available to support a denser, broader set of housing opportunities? So policies that can help workforce development, investments in infrastructure, whether that's buses, transit, water, other things, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the part of the country that you're in, those kinds of things might be equally, if not more important, depending on your own context. Okay, the second category that we talk about in the paper, we call public options for housing. And you may have heard of the public option from debates over healthcare. The idea is that there's private healthcare, health insurance providers, but we could also have a public option for health insurance, kind of like Medicare, but that would be available for anyone to buy into if they wanted to. A similar idea can apply in the housing context. You could imagine a kind of public option for housing in which governments put up the financing through either kind of revolving loan programs or other building programs to build housing that will then be available at market rates or subsidized rates to people in the community. That could be affordable housing or it could be market housing. That is something that is not part of the conversation today, but as much. But what it does is it says that a local government could actually be kind of like a housing developer. They could be the producer who is building this new housing. And the great thing about that is a local government doesn't have the need to have huge profits like private actors do, and so could actually take the money that's gained from the development and reinvest it back into producing more. We talk a little bit in our paper about mortgages and mortgage policies, which is a little bit more of a federal policy, as well as a way to think about how the public can operate to increase housing. A third category is tax policy. One of the things that we know is that if you put a tax on something, you may get less of it because it increases the cost of it. And so if part of the challenge in some areas is that we have too much, say, undeveloped land, vacant homes, vacant land that people are sitting on, perhaps because they see a rising housing market and want to wait a little longer to build because it'll be worth even more in a few years. In some cities, that may be happening. One can tax that and say, actually, there's going to be a cost if you're keeping places undeveloped. You can imagine that kind of thing on undeveloped land, on unoccupied houses, on vacancies, in rent, where people maybe think that instead of lowering their prices for rent, they should just keep the prices high and keep something vacant for a time. All of these are possibilities. Again, our point is not to say that these are always good ideas. It's just that tax policy should be part of the conversation. And then finally, we talk about what we call market shaping regulations. And these are a range of regulations, not just zoning, but we put zoning in this category. And these are places where you could see how regulatory policy could help shape the housing market as well. So I'll just highlight a few things. One is that we've seen in rental markets in different places in the country that some large renters are using algorithmic pricing and creating a wide variety of what people call junk fees, additional fees that are not disclosed at the starting point when they give you the kind of top line how much the rent is going to cost. And people could regulate these things at the local, state, or federal level. An example in the kind of junk fees category is maybe you're coming in for to rent and you find out what the rental price is on a monthly basis. You've comparison shopped a number of different properties, and then once you're there and you finally are in the process of actually signing your lease, you find out, well, there's 10 extra different kinds of fees that are one-time fees or monthly fees that they didn't tell you about beforehand, that are not part of higher cost, and that. Now you're well down the process and you may have already missed out on the opportunities in other places to rent because you moved on here without being able to see this, and you pay this extra cost. So thinking about disclosing what the real price is, what all the fees are, banning algorithmic pricing or price collusion are possibilities. Zoning is another area where we think part of the conversation has been really focused only on the myopic question, as Chris mentioned, about how do we loosen or get rid of zoning rules. But an important thing to understand about zoning is zoning itself is not good or bad. So that would be like saying law is good or bad. But law is a tool. It is a thing that is passed, and its content substantively could be any number of things, and those things could be good or bad. And so our view is that the way we should think about zoning is how do we use this tool to build the kind of market shaping zoning that we want. So often what you hear about is that there are rules in different places on minimum lot sizes, and that this is a bad thing because it says you can only have really large lots instead of having multiple houses on a one lot or more dense packed in housing. That's possibly a bad thing in some areas. But thinking only about getting rid of minimum lot sizes doesn't really raise all of the options. Another option might be saying we're going to have maximum lot sizes. You can't build in a certain area above a certain amount of lot size, and that would pack in more dense housing. That's just one idea. We talk about other ones in the paper, thinking about primary residences, thinking about occupancy, thinking about investors, and having investor free zones from institutional investors. There's lots of different ways to think about this. And again, the idea isn't that any particular idea is good or bad, or that it is necessary or not necessary, or that it will work everywhere, but rather that there's a much larger set of options that we should think about. And so when I think about what different jurisdictions are doing, having this kind of blunt force tool, we're just going to loosen zoning everywhere or get rid of it altogether, as some people have argued, isn't really the only option. It may not be the best option, and it may not be the right option for a particular community. In fact, we should expand our vision and try to see the whole set of policies that a community can undertake, which might mean focusing on a lot of other different things, from industrial policy to public options to tax policies to regulation, and yes, to zoning too, but to zoning that's focused in a way to try to think about what is the right way for this community to grow and develop. And I think, as Mark started us out with, thinking about what is the planning that a community is going into often includes zoning as part of that planning process. But that doesn't necessarily mean blanket deregulation or dezoning. It means thinking carefully about how you're going to grow in a way that integrates zoning along with a wide variety of other policy choices that cities, localities, states, and even the federal government can engage with. And so our hope is that the conversation really broadens out, and we think that would be better for the national conversation, and we think it would actually be better for a lot of local conversations, because a broader conversation allows us to tailor the specific policies to the specific communities. Because, as Chris started, our main view is that every community in this country is different, and they all have their own conditions. And that if you're not paying attention to those conditions and you think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, that's probably not going to be the right approach.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, just give you just a couple of things. One is, when somebody talks about getting rid of the zoning, my first thought is Koch brothers, which appears to be their solution to the housing problem, is to let anybody build anything. But the Koch brothers never talk about affordability. And I think in all of this, in all the housing work that we've done, there's barely a glance at what we need to do to make it affordable. So the county, our policy is, in most places of the county, you have to provide either 15% or 12.5% moderately priced dwelling units. If the county gets involved in deals, we've been able to push it as high as 30%. And we've done a number of projects where the developments are 100% affordable. But these only occur, to your point, when the government actually intervenes and plays a role. And we're now looking at modular, both on the single family level and small apartment townhouse level, but also at a larger level, because if we can't break the price of construction, even if we have, difficult rules on affordability, I cannot make people build that which is not affordable. And so we've got to figure out, are there other ways to do some of the construction? And we're looking at that. I'm a big believer that you can't talk about this housing policy abstractive of talking about affordability. So, the council that was driving this this last rezoning, and one of the ones that's coming up, they're the same council that received the projections that of our future growth, fully 75% of it would have incomes below 80% of area median income. And only 25% would be at 80% or higher. And as you can guess, this skews pretty tightly along racial lines. 75% of the Black and brown communities are at would not qualify for this kind of housing. We have, the percentages above 100% of AMI are very low in those communities, and much more likely to be. Our AMI is brought down because there's a vast disparity between white and Asian area median incomes and Black and brown area median incomes. And so when we target area median income, sometimes we're actually missing the people who need the housing the most, because we're targeting an average, and there are two communities that are far below the average. So those are things we struggle with. For affordability, you look at government participation is probably the key thing in terms of helping finance deals.
Yeah, I mean, government affordability financing, I think, is one important intervention, as is simply the government building more. The government can produce supply that can have a real impact. And I just want to highlight one thing. I mean, one thing you were saying that people don't focus on affordability in the zoning debates. Of course, they claim to be focusing on affordability. There's a view, it's called filtering, where they say, well, look, if we build a lot more market rate housing, then the new supply is going to filter down, and what would have become more expensive remains affordable. And I'll say these are, in many cases, good faith arguments made by sophisticated people and sophisticated empiricists. And I don't want to suggest that they're not making these arguments in good faith. But it strikes us that it bears a remarkable similarity to trickle-down economics.
Yes.
And even if these effects may, the effect of adding supply may moderate housing region-wide over time, as Ganesh put it, it's a very passive approach. And a faster, more direct approach is to produce the housing that we need and that is affordable to people now, instead of waiting for this filtering process to happen.
So it's I'm glad you talked about filtering, because I hear this all the time. I don't think it's a good faith argument, because I think you can look at places to see how much of a decline there is in prices when new development goes up. And, am I wrong in observing that if the new development has a significant gap between existing prices, it has less effect on lowering those prices? If somebody comes in and builds just above the previous market, then you'll have tenants who are willing to jump to the slightly more expensive building, and then that owner is faced with maybe having to reposition his in the market. But none of it drives it to the level of affordability. If I have to house people at 75% of AMI, people making under $75,000, $80,000, no amount of downward pressure from filtering is going to produce decent housing at that price range if this starts out at $3,000 or $4,000 a unit. Is that magical thinking?
Yeah, so, and I don't want to be the mouthpiece or the champion for the arguments against that, because fundamentally, I think I'm skeptical of the filtering argument myself. What the more sophisticated and good faith arguments will suggest is, well, look, putting in new luxury housing in a place may increase prices actually around that housing in the local area. But the claim is that it will moderate prices regionally. And the argument that they usually give is the most extreme, which is take Brooklyn, New York, where if you didn't turn all your carriage houses into $10 million luxury homes, they would be available as more affordable options to people, right? The problem with all of this is both that the geographic impact and scale of these impacts really matters and should matter. That is, if you're really driving up prices in a particular community, that may be itself a problem. It also, I think, is unconvincing ultimately on the problem of imputed demand. That is, the amount of housing demand in a place is not actually fixed. And one of the problems with letting the market try and grow its way into affordability, right, is that it may be that every new housing unit actually increases demand in an area that puts upward pressure on affordability. So I think that those dynamics have not been sufficiently teased apart.
Gentlemen, we have technically maybe 10 minutes left because the county executive has a hard stop. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the members of the media to see if they have any questions at this time for either of the professors. Please raise your hands. Members of the media, if you have questions. There's Jeannie Bixby, Bethesda Today. Good afternoon, Jeannie. Go ahead. You might need to
Excuse me.
unmute.
Sorry, I was muted. Still, after all these years, you'd think. But hi, Lorna, and hi, Mark, and thank you so much to our experts who came on. I was curious, both of you, if you could speak a little bit. You've talked a lot about a lot of options that you think are maybe the better way. How quickly are these things that can be implemented? Because I think that what we're seeing, particularly in Montgomery County, we're deeply affected by the changes in Washington and the federal workforce. So we're seeing a larger population of folks who are going to need more affordable or market rate housing than ever before. And it was already a crisis. So are these suggestions things that governments can implement quickly, or are these things that you see as more long-term, long-haul solutions?
Well, why don't I say, in the paper, we offer both. Some of the things are extremely easy to implement. So, I mentioned pre-approved building designs and pattern books, right? Local governments could adopt those, and that's a relatively low procedural challenge, in the context of different things. So that's the kind of thing that I think is one example of something that would be relatively easy. There are things that would be harder in the list also that we've put in and that would take longer as well. And so we've offered both. And so I think there's a real opportunity for governments to do this. And part of it really is seeing what the ways in which you can get active and interested are, and really taking an active role on it. If you can get a city council to do a bunch of work on zoning, the city council can also do a bunch of work on a lot of these other topics that we've mentioned here too. And I think one of the really exciting things about this moment from a housing affordability perspective is that there's real interest in the topic everywhere at all levels of government. I don't think there's anyone who thinks that in the context of the inflation of the last few years and the cost of living crisis that a lot of people are facing, that housing isn't part of that story and part of that challenge for a lot of people. And so whether it's a state legislature or even the U.S. Congress, which, we all know has its share of challenges in passing, to be fair, almost anything on any topic these days, it seems. But the Senate just very recently had a housing policy go through the Banking and Housing Committee that went through unanimously. Have a wide range of things where South Carolina Republican Tim Scott, who's the chair of that committee, and Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, co-sponsored that and introduced that bill, and it went through swimmingly and very easily. So I think we're at a moment where there's things that are moving and can move at all levels of government. It's to my mind, really a function of people opening the aperture to what the possibilities are. And so I think there's a lot that can be done, pretty readily and in a short time frame.
Thank you, Professor. Members of the media, any additional questions for our guests this afternoon? No more questions?
Can I add one more thing in response to that last question?
Go ahead.
When we're talking about speed and how quickly different policies could be implemented, remember, it's speed as compared to what? So zoning reform may feel like it's something that a government can do very quickly, and in fact it can. But that's not the end goal. The end goal is actually more housing. And it's not clear that a government that steps in and very quickly enacts zoning reform is actually going to produce outcomes on the time scale that we need without more active intervention.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you both.
Thank you.
This is Suzanne. This is Suzanne
Pollack.
Montgomery. Yeah, for some reason, I don't have the hand button today. Or I don't see it to raise your hand. I just have a quick question. I don't know if the two experts have looked specifically at Montgomery County and have any recommendations for this county.
I'm afraid not. At least I have not looked closely at Montgomery County specifically, and have no advantages over the county executive in terms of local knowledge. Yeah,
unfortunately, I'm in the same boat, and I think to kind of be particular and defend our position in an additional way, I think our approach would be, one should know quite a bit about the county before offering some suggestions that would be specific to the county. I think this is one of these places where a little learning is a dangerous thing. You really need to know quite a bit because each of these communities is quite different, and so I wouldn't want to venture anything either specifically, just not knowing enough about the area.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Suzanne. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, professors, for joining us
Thank you.
this afternoon. Mr. County Executive, you technically have 3 minutes left of this
So,
media briefing.
I'll
How are we
probably
going to handle this?
I'm going to stretch it. I'm going to try to stretch it till 8. We'll see. If I have to, I can be a little bit late if I have to for the other thing I'm going to do. I just wanted to say I really appreciated the comments, and I'm very interested, particularly on the ability to do pre-approved drawings. I mean, it sounds like you're talking something akin to form-based code, where once the form base is in there, if you're building what's in the form, nobody gets a second bite at the apple. And I really do appreciate that. I'll also say in the last comment about having to know us, that's one of the things that's frustrated me is people have adopted here this solution of missing middle housing and housing everywhere. And us is not them. We are so radically different. Arlington, they had no reservoir of places to build for the next 30 years. Minneapolis built out, New York built out. So all these places that are doing this, by and large, have had to face real constraints in terms of where you build if you plan on future growth. And I'm sitting in a county that's planned its future growth and actually has places for people to go. But the problem that we haven't solved in the future growth is affordability. The townhouses, the apartments, all that stuff is in these plans. But there's nothing in these plans that makes them affordable. And I think that's our challenge, is to figure out how do we do that more. And I appreciate you referencing the government should build things, because that's actually one of the things we're looking at doing is, taking our stuff and partnering with somebody who's a builder, not a developer, and getting something built that can go on the market and be more affordable. Because the more middle people you take out of the deal, the lower the rents are. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank
And
you.
I will be in touch with you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to you all about our project.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you both for joining us today. Mr. County Executive, if you can
I'm
move
gonna
on
talk
to the
real-
next topics.
I'd talk real quickly about a few other things. One is, National Night Out was last night. I did, I guess, 5 stops along the way, and it was really great to see folks out and about in the community. We had some really huge turnouts. Alney was enormous as always, so it was just really good to be out and see this. And it is a good opportunity for, people in the community to get to know our police and fire. And it's part of, the efforts that we're making to make everybody feel like we're all attached together, that, this is not an us versus them, but this is a place where police and fire in the community can work together to build a safer, stronger community. And I think National Night Out helps reinforce that. Along a similar line, I want to note that America's Safest Suburbs has determined that Bethesda is the number 2 in the country and Rockville is the number 4 nationwide at neighborhood safety. They evaluated 360 places within 15 to 45 minutes of the U.S.'s 100 largest cities. They judged the suburbs on criteria like crime, deadly car crashes, drug overdose deaths, alcohol consumption rates. They used the FBI crime stats for 2023 and county health rankings. And we wind up, again, Bethesda number 2, Rockville number 4. Congratulations to those communities and congratulations to the county for having places like that. So it's good to know we get noticed. The other day I was over at Cabin John Volunteer Fire Department. During the floods last Thursday, when many people were surprised by the severity of the floods, there was an incident at Bradley Boulevard near Mercy Hollow Lane, and Aish Silvaraj was in a car with his nanny and his nanny's child. The water overtook the car, and the car was stalled in the water. And Aish was able to climb out the window onto the roof of the car and help the child and help his nanny get on the roof of the car as well before the firefighters arrived. And they were able to get there quickly. They got the victims away from the car, and it was a happy ending to what could have been a bad story. And this Sunday, his family came to the Cabin John Fire Department and presented our fire and rescue services with a $10,000 check in appreciation of the work they did to save their son, the nanny, and their child. So it was a nice little human touch, and I think people should know, these are the kind of stories we don't hear enough about. In a story we hear too much about, I think we know about the incident with the Montgomery County Public Schools, the failure to keep up to date with background checks for staff and for people who work with children in the schools. It's a serious problem. I know from talking to the superintendent that he is aware of this, and this is a priority to deal with it. Our county departments will help them to expedite getting these checks done, because, we cannot afford to have these many people without the kind of checks they need on their background. And they need the initial screening, so we also have continuous monitoring. All this stuff has to be done. There are too many problems nationwide that come about from people who've got backgrounds that mean they shouldn't be near children. We don't need to be one of those places, and we've got to make sure that the background checks get done. I know that, like I said, Superintendent Taylor is putting his attention to this, and we're going to make sure we support their efforts so it's done as quickly as possible. And lastly, I'm going to say we are providing free vaccinations to school-age children without medical insurance, and it continues by appointment through our Department of Health and Human Services. And I encourage your audience to call our immunization program at 240-777-1050 to schedule an appointment. And we'll provide vaccinations at the upcoming MCPS Back to School Fair, Saturday, August 23rd, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Westfield Wheaton Mall. And I will turn it over.
Dr. Bridgers, anybody else has opening remarks?
Hi, Lorna. No, in the interest of time, no additional updates from me today.
Dr. Ashford, Dr. Stoddard, no remarks today?
No, thank you.
No, let's just take questions. I think that's good.
Excellent. Then we'll take additional questions from members of the media. If there are any questions regarding any other topics, please raise your hands. There's Jeannie Bixby again. Go ahead, Jeannie. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you both. Mark, I have a question for you. This is from my colleague, Elia Griffin, who could not be on the call. Her question is that a recent Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation Economic Indicators report shows that the county has had a very low permitting of multifamily housing units over the past 9 months, with nearly zero permitting of multifamily units for rent. Are you familiar with the reports? Do you have thoughts on it? Do these numbers concern you?
Look, everything is slowing down. And, the headlines in the country right now is a slowdown in the market. There's the continued uncertainty about interest rates because they have not budged. There's the continued worry about tariffs and driving up prices. So there are a lot of external factors that have driven those prices that have made it harder to build and to move forward. There's also the problem of, what is the real demand in the county right now? And, I keep raising this issue. We're permitted for, over 30,000 units that a person could build if they just pulled the building permit. And that hasn't been happening, but that's not new. That hasn't been happening for a decade. And so, if people are concerned, we need to think about what our housing policies are and possibly what we've permitted. One thing that's changed, and I expect to see permits last year, there were a number of developments that, as they were planned by Park and Planning, were supposed to be high-rise developments. They were on the stack of developments that weren't going anywhere. In the last year, particularly this spring, a number of developers came forward and got permission to lower those buildings from high-rise to more moderate heights that'll be both more affordable but also able to build. And I expect those developers to go through to initiate the permit process as soon as their new plans are approved and they get designs ready to go into permitting. So I think, we're seeing something that is not totally abnormal. It's a bit of a national issue. And also those numbers don't include Rockville and Gaithersburg. Their permitting doesn't show up in Montgomery County permitting, and there's certainly things going on in Rockville and Gaithersburg. So I don't look at that as the end of the world. And I think that, we're dealing with multiple factors that could have influenced it this year. And hopefully some of those factors diminish over the coming year.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeannie, members of the media, any additional questions for the county executive this afternoon, even though he needs to depart? Any more questions? I guess that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.